Hello, your friendly neighborhood host, JT Wheatley here again, back for another episode of the History Comics Podcast, this time with the life of Whilce Portacio, the odd Image founder out. Of the 7 original Image Comics founders, Whilce Portacio was in many ways the odd man out. He wasn't there at the beginning, being away in the Philippines at the time, and was never made partner and thus never formed his own studio. He is an artist, pure and simple, and never wanted the business side of the comic books. All that being said, his mark in Image Comics and the industry cannot be denied. Whilce Portacio was born on July 8, 1963 in Sangley Point, Cavite City in the Philippines. His family moved around a lot when he was young, so he grew up on Midway Island in the Philippines throughout his life. As the oldest son, he is the Kua in the Filipino, and expected to think of his family first and foremost. As a child, Whilce Portacio dreamed of being an astronaut, but as he grew up, he soon learned his height and eyesight would disqualify him for the opportunity. Luckily, he was also developing into a talented artist. Portacio won awards since the 6th grade for his art, including one from the National Scholastic Arts Institute. Portacio would enter every kind of art contest, including poster competitions, and took 2 years of college-level art classes while still in high school. He was so advanced. However, his parents always wanted him to become an architect, believing that to be a more stable job. His family returned to the Philippines when his dad retired. Having 4 kids, leaving Hawaii made it cheaper for him. Portacio found it a culture shock as he didn't speak the native language Tagalog. Thankfully, he made a new friend in Scott Williams, who introduced him to comic books, including the work of Neil Adams, Gil Kane, Gene Colan, Jack Kirby, and Jim Sternenko. Portacio immediately started to try to copy their style to the point where he was imitating whatever artists he was reading at the time. He was also influenced by European artists thanks to the Heavy Metal magazine, where he first saw the brilliant French artist Moebius. TV also was a huge influence on Portacio, as he saw a great deal of Japanese animation, what we now call anime, and live-action shows while living in the Philippines. Ironically, Portacio never learned about the Philippines' own rich history in comics when he first lived there. Called comics, spelled Komiks in Filipino, the medium has been popular in the country since the 1920s and became especially popular after World War II, as they were influenced by the comic books American GIs brought with them when they were stationed there. Soon, comics started to be influenced by the Philippine mythology and comida, Filipino literature. Today, Pinoy manga is produced, having been heavily influenced by Japanese manga, essentially the Philippines' own version of manga comics. Despite his love of comic books, Whilce Portacio did go to college for architecture per his family's wishes. However, his art skill was still so advanced that by the end of his first semester, his teachers would send many of his fellow students to him for help. By his sophomore year, Portacio went into his rebellious phase and flunked out, thus his parents sent him to San Diego, California to live with his aunt. As it would happen, the move would be just 4 months before the San Diego Comic-Con. At the convention in 1984, there was a huge talent search on, so Whilce Portacio took his portfolio in hopes of getting a job. He was discovered by Carl Potts, who brought him on to ink Frank Serracaro's and Chris Warner's pencils on Alien Legion, which was created by Potts, Serracaro, and Alan Zillentz, a futuristic series under Marvel's Epic imprint that followed the adventures of the Force Nomad, a military unit of very alien species modeled after the French Foreign Legion. Terry Austin, the inker on the series, needed help, and according to Portacio, Potts called up Ann Nocente, a writer-editor at Marvel, who needed an inker on the series, so Portacio was brought on. In 1985, Portacio inked the Longshot miniseries for penciler Arthur Adams and writer Anna Nocente, who co-created a character in the miniseries about a genetically created being from Mojo World whose journeys to Earth. Longshot has the ability to influence probable outcomes around him and will later become a member of the X-Men, and has been a recurring character in the books ever since, even romancing the fellow mutant the Dazzler and having a child, who would later be revealed to be the X-Force character Shatterstar. Arthur Adams would be a major influence on Whilce Portacio and many other artists, with his highly detailed, tight art style. Adams would influence many of the future image artists as well, and of note, his labor-intensive style led to him being late on many books. It took him 8 months to pencil Longshot number 1, though largely due to writer Anna Nocente's near 20 panels a page mandate. However, it's interesting to note that many image artists would follow in his lateness as well as his highly detailed style. As for Whilce Portacio specifically, he was quickly gaining a reputation as an inker who had the great potential of becoming a penciler. Portacio did comment he was a bit disenchanted when he came to Marvel, learning that there was no Marvel bullpen anymore, as most artists worked at home or their own offices. Plus, not to say every job was a dream job, as Portacio also worked on Adolescent Radioactive Black Belt Hamsters, a satire knockoff of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Ironic, considering that they were in themselves a satire of the Daredevil Frank Miller comics. Portacio was given a chance to work on the first 3D annual as well, with pages coming in an 11 by 16 FedEx box, which he was expected to both redraw and ink. Soon Portacio was getting work reworking other people's pages and getting even further frustrated, as he wanted to be a penciler in his own right. The money was good, though, but he wanted his opportunity, so he approached Carl Potts again, who decided to give him work on the Punisher, at the time one of Marvel's biggest characters. Whilce Portacio was the penciler for the Punisher series in 1988, and quickly became popular for his slick, realistic style. Soon Portacio was being recognized at conventions, and though getting frustrated by some fans who kept asking him things like, "Why doesn't the Punisher bust criminals' kneecaps more?" Soon he wanted to move on, and thus approached Carl Potts again, who Portacio called the perfect editor for him at the time. Portacio was able to bring in his friend Scott Williams to become his inker. Carl Potts also introduced Whilce Portacio to Jim Lee around this time, which would soon form a fateful friendship. Reportedly, Lee was the new guy at Marvel, and Potts thought Portacio would be the perfect person to show him around. Portacio would quickly introduce Lee to Scott Williams, and pretty soon all three were talking about forming their own studio. There was some initial friction about where to do it, though, as Lee lived in Berkeley at the time and Portacio was in San Diego, but soon Lee moved down to San Diego as well, since Scott Williams was also there. During this time, Whilce Portacio was also worked on Legion of the Night, which took about a year before moving on to the X-Factor and the Uncanny X-Men, notably issue number 267, which he worked on with Jim Lee and Scott Williams. Portacio preferred working on the X-Factor, as it consisted of the original team members like Cyclops and Marvel Girl / Jean Grey. His art style was based on the manga and Arthur Adams, and he thought he would work on Uncanny X-Men for 20 years. Part of this was a major push by Marvel for the X-Men books, and having two of their top artists, Jim Lee and Whilce Portacio, working on Uncanny X-Men and X-Factor respectively, with Scott Williams inking both of them. Reportedly, Portacio wanted to return to the original X-Men team along with killing off a number of characters and villains, which only caused friction with writer Chris Claremont. While Whilce Portacio did end up co-creating the X-Men character Bishop with John Byrne in Uncanny X-Men number 282 on November of 1982, the mutant from the future who comes to present day to hunt down the villain Fitzroy. The studio Jim Lee, Scott Williams, and Whilce Portacio would form would be Homage, and the three would work together all day while passing inspirations, such as anime like Appleseed, about a futuristic police force in a dystopian city. Soon, Mark Silvestri and Joe Chiodo would join them in San Diego, fulfilling Portacio's personal dream of a Marvel bullpen, as he just went and made his own. To Portacio, he felt Jim Lee was like Stan Lee while he was John Romita Sr., with Lee being the more businessman while Portacio was the artist. His popularity was so high at this point he would be interviewed by Stan Lee on the comic book's Great Series, which also featured other notable creators like Todd McFarlane and Rob Liefeld, who would soon all form much larger plans for themselves. He was first approached to join Image Comics by Jim Lee. He wasn't sure if he wanted to come or not, so he spoke to him in kind of a code. However, Todd McFarlane openly approached him about coming to Image Comics and would ultimately be the last to join the group, and as a result was never made a full partner. He had left the States for a month to visit his family in the Philippines, and thus was never part of any of the major plans forming Image Comics. Portacio did eventually show up for the third Image Comics meeting, having missed the first two. Portacio wasn't too worried about leaving for Image either, being a professional artist his whole life and able to make a living doing it, despite being the head of the family and even supporting his sisters and his grandmother. To Portacio, he also knew that Image Marvel would always have him back, which they would eventually do, and if things went south, he could always be a teacher as well. At Image Comics, he created Wetworks with Brandon Cho, while also helping develop Wildstorm's digital coloring scheme. He wanted the comic to be about a military unit, but it needed a fresh angle, being inspired by films like The Predator and Eager Sanction. Ultimately, he decided on a commando unit who obtained a liquid gold armor that each gave each member different abilities. For example, Dozer has super strength, while Grail can project energy, all while fighting an army of vampires. Portacio also wanted to do something pretty violent, as he felt hampered by the CCCA at Marvel. For example, they had a problem with depicting exit wounds from bullet wounds. However, he refused to release the first issue until the book was finished, which got further delayed when his sister, who was also a receptionist at Wildstorm, died. As the Kua of the family, Portacio was focused on helping them get back on his feet, while of course dealing with his own grief. He did have Wetworks planned out, though, and would later get criticized for making the story too big with too many characters. The comic did factor into the larger Wildstorm universe, as it starred Dane, a former member of Team 7 who now leads the current one, which is what Wetworks became. Despite all this, Wetworks was a hit when they finally released, selling just a few thousand less than Jim Lee's Wildcats, Wildstorm's premiere book, and ultimately ran for 43 issues until 1998. During this time, McFarlane Toys also produced a line of action figures based on Wetworks in 1995 and 1996. In addition, a loosely inspired version of the Pilgrim appeared on DC's Legend of Tomorrow in the episodes The Magnificent Eight and The Last Refuge, which aired on April of 2016. The character does have similar powers to her comic book character counterparts, just time travel and superhuman strength, but is an assassin over being a hero and doesn't even share the comic book character's real name. All of this was possible with DC buying Wildstorm back in 1998, which included Portacio's Wetworks. Whilce Portacio preferred being an artist over business, and as a result he sold Wetworks to Wildstorm and then moved to the Philippines for 5 years, where he met his wife. All the while he was fulfilling his work as the Kua of his family, getting his sisters set up in school, moving their parents to the States, and buying them a house. While in the Philippines, he found himself a local celebrity as a successful comic book artist, and soon was approached by such burgeoning talent as Lionel Yu and Negro Tadeo. Eventually, he found himself working as an agent mentor to many of them. Whilce Portacio later worked at Avalon, which was run by Brian Haberlin, with many of the artists who first approached him in the Philippines, and was proud to mentor them, especially Lionel Yu, whose style was originally almost a copycat of Portacio's. According to Portacio, he noticed Liu's art was brilliant in layouts, but ruined when he started cross-hatching and adding blacks. Portacio forbade him from doing the latter, and only allowed it once Liu's art style started to develop. Soon, Lionel Yu received a job offer from Marvel for Wolverine, and has been a successful comic book artist ever since, most recently working on Captain America for Marvel and creating the first Filipino superhero to appear in Marvel Comics with Wave, in the War of the Realms New Agents of Atlas #1 on May 8, 2019. In 1996, Whilce Portacio did Iron Man for Heroes Reborn event with Jim Lee at Marvel, and later returned to Marvel in full to work with writer Warren Ellis on an X-Men relaunch. Portacio's motivation was personal, as he was married with a child on the way, and he wanted to be back in the States to ensure his child's citizenship. However, that was right when another tragedy struck in Portacio's life as he went into a diabetic coma. A week after his daughter was born in August of 2000, Whilce Portacio went into a diabetic coma from a failing pancreas, which he later learned was a result of having diabetes, which he didn't even know till after the fact. A week later, Portacio woke up 30 pounds lighter and unable to walk, stand, or draw. He would take 6 months to recover, and during this time, Portacio stated, "My mind could see what I wanted to draw, but my hand wouldn't do it." Thankfully, Scott Williams gave him a management job at Wildstorm until he recovered, and he would eventually return to penciling, working on titles for Wildstorm like Stormwatch. Portacio also learned he had sleep apnea, which he kept his body from getting proper sleep, and as a result couldn't function fully when he was awake. You and me both, sir. Once treated, Whilce Portacio was able to return to work fully. On November 2006, Portacio returned to Wetworks with Volume 2, but would leave after issue number 6. The series would run to issue number 15, which ended on January of 2008, to work with DC on the Batman Confidential series, which launched that December. That comic was similar to the previous Batman Legends of the Dark Knight, which told earlier tales of the Dark Knight's crime-fighting career. Portacio penciled the first 6-issue arc with writer Andy Diggle, detailing Batman's first encounter with Lex Luthor. On January 9th, 2008, it was announced that Whilce Portacio would become the regular penciler on Spawn, with issue number 185, which also featured Spawn's co-creator, Todd McFarlane, returning to co-plotting duties with writer Brian Hoagland. After his run on Spawn, Portacio returned to Marvel, where he worked on Incredible Hulk number 18 and also returned to the Uncanny X-Men. Today, Whilce Portacio continues to work as a regular artist throughout comics, from Marvel to DC to Image and even Valiant. He remains a talented artist and a proud Filipino, most recently showing off his Manila variant cover for Arrow number 3, which was an homage to his Uncanny X-Men cover for issue number 282, this time featuring Wave, Sea Hunter, and the Red Feather, Filipino superheroes. While he never made a huge splash as his fellow Image founders, he continues to make a successful living as an artist, and considering the many personal challenges he faced along the way, that is quite an accomplishment. Not everyone is meant to be a successful businessman or a superstar. Sometimes you just end up being a great working talent, and that is something that Whilce Portacio